We are continuing in the book of Joshua, and today we are in the book of Joshua, chapter 5, and we are just looking at a few verses. And I'm going to read to you starting at Joshua chapter 5, verse 13 to verse 15, and it says this. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" He said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped him and said, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. This is a part of the story that can sometimes get overlooked, but I think it's really important that we take some time to pause and learn something from Joshua. There are three assumptions that are being challenged for both you and me, and I want to share with you what I learned. Today, the title of our sermon is Don't Assume. I'm talking about assumptions. And when we deal with assumptions, where do our assumptions come from? Most of our assumptions come from our previous experiences in life. Both our positive assumptions and our negative assumptions come from our life experiences. And they especially come from the upbringing that we've had, and they also especially come from the places in which we grew up. So the families that we grew up in. For example, in my family, we are very vocal and very forward, and we don't ask a lot of questions. In my family, we make a lot of statements, and if we want to challenge a statement, I don't know that I agree with that statement, or well, why would you believe that, or something like that. Somebody makes a statement, and then we interact on whether or not we believe that that statement is reflective of the conversation. And I've had to learn that in different environments, not everybody knows what to do with statements the way I feel is normal. And so I've started to learn to ask questions as a way of engaging the people around me. Assumptions can often get in the way of us getting to know each other, and even can get in the way of our relationship with God. And so I want to go through this verse by verse, almost line by line, these two verses, so that we can learn to question our assumptions. Joshua was by Jericho, and it says he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a man with his sword drawn. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were to see somebody with a weapon drawn, my first instinct would be either to run away or to attack them. Joshua did something that I thought was quite unique, because the emotion that I'm sure that he was feeling was some sense of anxiety or fear. And some of us can get frozen in our fear, or some of us just choose to run in our fear. But Joshua did something that I thought was really courageous. He moved toward the person that it could have been seen as a perceived threat and asked him a very clarifying question. Are you for us, or are you for our adversaries? Are you for us, or are you for our enemies? So this is the first assumption that is being challenged. Don't assume that you have all the information you need to make a good decision. Stop. Take some time to gather information. Proverbs 3:5 says, "Do not lean on your own understanding and challenges us to, in all of our ways, acknowledge God so that God can direct our path. It is so easy to get caught up in the emotion of a situation that we forget that we have to be information gatherers. It is so easy for us to go to the assumptions of our past experiences and to not get to know someone. It's so easy for us to interact with somebody that we know reminds us of somebody else in our past that we may have had a positive or negative experience, and then we place those assumptions on someone else, and we fail to allow ourselves to get to know them for who they truly are. Don't assume. Don't assume you have all the information you need to make a good decision because of the feeling that you have. He says this, and the man immediately responds, "No, I am the commander of the Lord's army. I am a commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua immediately, he fell with his face to the earth and he worshiped him. So this is the second assumption that is being challenged by the story. Do not assume that your relationship with God is so strong that you will always recognize how and when God is at work, and even through whom. Because this is the situation. Your enemy is not always God's enemy. And God is not always for your battles, but God is fighting a very different battle. Sometimes we can get so caught up in winning our own battles, the battles of a difficult conversation, of feeling that I need to be justified and right, the battles of proving that I am really better than another person, the battle of wanting to make sure that I get the credit that I deserve for the work that I have done. But your battles are not always God's battles. The battle that God is fighting is one for the very heart and soul of every person on this earth. So when you fight your battles, make sure that you aren't asking God if God is on your side, but that you are asking how you can be on God's side. Joshua didn't even recognize God. He was so stuck in his head, in his thoughts, with the battle that he saw before him, that he missed God. When he realized that he almost missed God, he bows down and he worships him. And then he asks this poignant question. He asks this, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" And this is the third thing, the third assumption that is challenged. Don't assume that you can strategize this battle without seeking God's intentional guidance and direction. And do you know that sometimes when we have one plan, God decides to interrupt that plan? And sometimes when we have no plan at all and aren't expecting to do anything, God shows up and asks us to do something that scares us. So I hope that that is your continuous question. I hope that that's a continuous question that comes out of your mouth during your times of prayer. What message does my Lord have for his servant? God, how do you want to direct me and my life? How do you want me to move forward in this particular difficult situation in my life? God, I'm extremely depressed and I need to know, how do I move forward in this battle? God, I'm struggling with a difficult relationship, and how do I move forward in what seems like a very difficult battle? God, I'm struggling with addiction. How do I move forward in this battle? God, I am I'm struggling with having a difficult conversation because the reality is I don't like having difficult conversations, and so I avoid them, but I know I need to have it, and I just don't know how to move forward. God, how do I move forward in this battle? It's interesting to know that God calls us to move forward into battles when we least expect it. Joshua was not expecting to run into God and the commander of God's army. Joshua looked up and suddenly the commander of the Lord's army was there. And God often shows up and catches us off guard. From the very beginning of this covenant that is now being fulfilled with the nation of Israel, God showed up. When God shows up, it often catches us off guard. From the very beginning, when God made that first promise to Abraham, God was catching him off guard. You see, Abraham took his wife into a place where he knew there were kings that he believed did not follow God, and he lied to them and said that his wife really wasn't his wife so that he could save his own life. And suddenly God shows up in a dream to those kings, telling them that Abraham is one of his prophets and that he must give Abraham's wife back and send them off. And that happened on more than one occasion. God caught Isaac off guard because Isaac was actually asked to be sacrificed by his father. And so he is on an altar with his father holding a knife above his head, ready to sacrifice him for God. And God showed up saying, "Stop." God shows up and asks us to do these unexpected things. God shows up with Jacob, and he is running away from Esau. He stops in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a desert, and he grabs a stone and uses it as his pillow. He's in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly in a dream he sees a staircase of angels ascending and descending from the throne room of God. And Jacob says, "Surely God was in this place and I didn't even know it. I wasn't even aware of it." God showed up with Joseph when he was thrown into a pit by his brothers and then again thrown into the pit of prison. And in the midst of that place, God showed up, grabbed Joseph out of that place and made him the leader of all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. God showed up in the unexpected place of Moses while he was tending his sheep in a burning bush and said to Moses, "This place that is in the middle of nowhere is holy ground." Then God shows up with Joseph, sending the commander of his army with his sword drawn and says to him, "You are standing on holy ground. Yes, I am God and I am in this place." God shows up in unexpected places, so don't assume. Don't assume that you have all the information that you need, because in that assumption, you might find yourself fighting with God. Don't assume that your relationship with God is so strong that you will always recognize how and when God is at work. Let God surprise you and allow yourself to see the many facets in which God is at work. Don't assume that you need to strategize your entire battle, that you need to have it figured out from the beginning to the end. As a matter of fact, without God's intentional guidance, you may miss the strategy that God had for you. So be careful with your assumptions, because sometimes we get so caught up in our assumptions that we miss God. But I am so glad. I am so glad that God's work of salvation is not our work, but it is something that we are asked to participate in. I'm glad that we are not the ones that have to lead the battles of the difficult situations in our lives, but God calls us into those places, guides us, and works with us. I'm so glad because God uses the most unexpected people to do his amazing and perfect work. God used people like Abraham, who was a liar, and like Isaac's mother, Sarah, who did not believe that God would keep his promises. God used people like Jacob, who was a deceiver, like Joseph, who was an arrogant dreamer. God used people like Moses, who was full of self-doubt. God used people like Joshua, who was a young kid that helped an old man up and down a mountain and is now leading an entire nation. I'm so glad because if God can use people like that, then God can use people like me and like you. So we have to be careful not to make bad assumptions. Don't assume that we have all the information to make a good decision, but to brew in the questions. We can't assume that our relationship, no matter how strong it is, because if there was anyone that could hear the voice of God, that could recognize the energy and the ambiance of God after Moses has died, it was Joseph, but Joseph missed him. So don't assume that your relationship with God is so strong that you will always recognize how and when God is at work. And don't assume that you can strategize the battles of your life so much so that you can do that without seeking God's intentional guidance and direction. I'm glad that God is bigger than our assumptions. And I am glad that God is calling each of us to get ready for battle, but not the battle that we think we need to fight. God is calling us to get ready for the battle that he is getting ready to fight with the enemy that tempts us to put our personal comfort before the charge of the Great Commission that calls us to go out into all the world and to share what's done and is doing in our lives. And through that testimony is going to use those moments to transform the lives of the people we share that with. I'm so glad that God finds us in unexpected places. And so I want to challenge you right now. Take off your sandals. Take off your loafers, your flip-flops. Take off your socks. Put your feet firmly on the ground and recognize that God is with you and you are on holy ground. So get ready for your battle.